The sun bled out over Dusty Gulch, painting the sky in shades of rust and old blood. That's the first thing you noticed. Not the beauty, the violence of it. A stagecoach, caked in the grime of 1,000 forgotten miles, groaned to a halt. The door swung open and a silk dress stepped out. Then the woman wearing it, Clara Worthington. She looked like a misplaced porcelain doll, all wide eyes and city softness, completely out of tune with the splintered boardwalks and the hard, suspicious faces staring back at her. In her gloved hand she clutched a letter, the paper yellowed and brittle as old bone. It was a promise from a dead man, her uncle, a promise of a fortune buried deep in the guts of Coyote Canyon. The map inside was a spiderweb of lies, the trail a death sentence. But the fire in Clara's eyes burned brighter than the fear. You could see it right away. This wasn't just about money. This was about something else. Whispers followed her like shadows, slithering from behind cracked windows and dusty doorways. They all pointed her to one place, the saloon. The air inside was thick enough to choke on, a foul stew of cheap whiskey, cigar smoke, and simmering resentment. The whole room seemed to tilt, every line of sight, every hushed conversation, bending around a single figure slumped at the bar. He was a mountain in the shape of a man. Locals called him Thomas Boone. Some just called him the Giant. His head skimmed the rafters, and his shoulders were as wide as a coffin. He nursed his whiskey in a silence so profound it was louder than all the noise around it. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their fear a visible force field around him. It wasn't respect. It was terror. Clara's heels made a sharp, defiant click-clack on the worn floorboards. Every eye was on her, a lamb walking into a wolf's den. She didn't flinch. She walked straight up to that mountain and looked up, and up. "You're Thomas Boone," she said. Her voice was steady, a clean note in a discordant room. He turned his head slowly, just enough to catch her in his gaze. His eyes were gray like a storm front moving in. A flicker of something, not amusement, maybe just curiosity, passed through them. He gave a single, slow nod. "I need a guide," she declared, her voice ringing with a certainty she couldn't possibly feel. She unfolded the brittle map on the sticky bar top, right between them. To Coyote Canyon. A low rumble started in his chest, the sound of rocks grinding together deep underground. "It's dangerous." It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. From him, it sounded like a promise. A smirk touched her lips, but her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. "Danger is my middle name." That got a chuckle out of him, a sound like distant thunder rolling through the hills. Too big a job for a city gal. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the words she'd practiced 100 times on the long ride over. Words that would change everything. "Too big for me," she breathed, her eyes locking onto his. "But I'll try." For a second the whole saloon held its breath. The giant stared at the city doll, and something ancient and unspoken passed between them. He wasn't just looking at her. He was looking through her. Then he drained his glass in one swallow, the glass looking like a child's toy in his massive hand. He slammed it down on the bar. "Dawn," he rumbled. "Be ready." And with that, the mountain turned his back, leaving Clara standing alone in a sea of hostile stares. She'd gotten her guide, but as she walked out, she heard the whispers again, sharp and venomous. "He's taking another one." She won't be coming back either. The stable at first light smelled of hay and dread. Clara was there, the silk dress gone, replaced by borrowed men's trousers and a simple shirt. She looked less like a doll and more like a ghost, pale and determined. Thomas was already there, saddling his horse, a beast almost as impossibly large as he was. The animal's name was Blaze, and it watched Clara with intelligent, wary eyes. Thomas gave her a look, a quick up and down that missed nothing. A hint of something, approval, maybe, softened the hard lines of his face for a fraction of a second. Then it was gone. He motioned to a small, nervous-looking pony. It was hers. The animal shied away as she approached, sensing her unease. She fumbled with the reins, her city hands clumsy and unsure. Suddenly, his hand was there, covering hers. It was huge, calloused, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. He didn't speak. He just guided her hands, showing her the right way to hold the leather. Then, with an ease that defied his size, he gripped her by the waist and lifted her into the saddle as if she were made of air. "Hold tight," he murmured, the words more of a command than a comfort. As they rode out of Dusty Gulch, the town watched them go in dead silence. Not a single person waved, not a single friendly face wished them well. They just watched, their eyes like chips of stone, as the giant led the city girl toward the jagged mouth of the canyon, toward the place no one ever came back from. The trail narrowed almost immediately, the canyon walls rising up on either side like stone teeth. Loose scree rolled under the horses' hooves, a constant, unsettling rattle. Every jolt and bump was a reminder to Clara of how out of place she was. The dust was already a fine red film on her skin. Thomas rode ahead, a silent, hulking shape against the rising sun. He moved with the landscape, a part of it, while she fought against it with every step. After an hour of silence, his voice boomed back at her, startling a flock of crows from a dead tree. "Why Coyote Canyon?" She hesitated. The simple answer was the gold. The easy answer. "My uncle's letter," she called out, her voice thin in the vast emptiness. "He promised a chest of gold." He didn't turn around, but she could feel his skepticism like a physical weight. "Plenty tried," his voice echoed off the rocks. "None came back." As if the canyon itself was listening, Clara's pony chose that exact moment to stumble. A sharp cry escaped her lips as she was thrown sideways, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the saddle horn. She was falling, but the ground never came. In a blur of motion, Thomas was there. He'd moved his massive horse with impossible speed. One of his arms, thick as a tree trunk, wrapped around her waist, catching her, holding her suspended in midair. He pulled her from her saddle and settled her in front of him on Blaze, all in one fluid, powerful motion. The world stopped. She was pressed against his chest, a wall of solid muscle and leather. She could feel the steady, slow thump of his heart against her back. The danger of the fall, the fear of the canyon, it all just melted away, replaced by this shocking, unexpected closeness. He didn't say a word. He just held her there for a moment too long, his breath warm on the back of her neck. Then he spurred Blaze forward, his arm still locked around her like an iron bar. Clara didn't protest. She couldn't. Because as they rode deeper into the canyon, she saw it. Just off the trail, half hidden by a scrubby bush. A crude wooden cross sticking out of a fresh mound of dirt. A grave. Unmarked. Recent. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the whispers in town were true. People didn't come back. And her guide, the silent giant holding her now, was the only one who ever did. The canyon walls bled the light from the sky, and soon they were in a world of deep purple shadows and flickering firelight. Thomas had made camp with an efficiency that was both fascinating and intimidating. He moved like he was born in this wilderness. Clara sat across the small, crackling fire from him, the warmth doing little to chase away the cold knot of fear in her stomach. The image of that fresh grave was burned into her mind. She pulled out her uncle's letter again, as if the familiar words could offer some comfort. The ink was faded, the paper soft with age. She read the riddle at the bottom aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "The treasure is guarded where shadows dance." and the heart lies still. Thomas leaned back against his saddle, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes. The firelight played across the hard line of his jaw. "Riddles ain't my strength," he rumbled, "but I know this land, every rock, every cave." His voice held a promise of knowledge far deeper than any map. Clara watched him, this man who was a living contradiction. Feared in town, yet here, by the fire, he was a silent protector. She had to know. The question had been clawing at her all day. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "And what happened to the others? The ones who didn't come back?" The air grew heavy. The crackle of the fire was the only sound for a long moment. He shifted, the leather of his saddle creaking. He didn't look at her. He looked into the flames. "There was a party. A year ago," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Prospectors. Greedier than they were smart. They hired me." He paused, and Clara held her breath. "A storm came up. Flash flood. The canyon doesn't forgive mistakes. I was the only one who made it to high ground." He finally lifted his head, and his gray eyes found hers in the dark. They were filled with a deep, haunting sadness. "The town decided I was either cursed, or I took their gold and left them to die." Clara's heart ached for him. The town hadn't just misjudged him. They'd condemned him. "I don't believe that," she said softly, and she was surprised to find she meant it. "Why not?" he asked, a genuine question in his rough voice. "Because," she searched for the words, "because you lifted me onto my horse when you could have just watched me struggle. You caught me when I fell." He shrugged, looking back at the fire as if her words made him uncomfortable. "Something about you," he said, echoing his words from the saloon, "makes me curious." But then he added something new. "And your uncle," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I knew him. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't looking for gold." A shiver went down Clara's spine. A new piece of the puzzle just slammed into place, and it changed the entire picture. "What?" she whispered. "What was he looking for?" Thomas just shook his head, the firelight catching the grim set of his mouth. "Something he said he had to put right," he said. "He told me the map was a key, not a path. And he warned me. He said the real danger in this canyon isn't the rock slides or the rivers." He leaned forward slightly, his massive frame casting a long, dancing shadow. "It's the thing that guards it." Dawn broke, and the canyon walls seemed to press in on them, squeezing the sky into a thin blue ribbon above. They rode in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was shared. Clara watched Thomas, really watched him. She saw the way his hands, large enough to crush stone, handled Blaze's reins with a gentle, practiced touch. She saw the way his eyes constantly scanned the cliffs, reading the landscape like a book. He was more than just big. He was aware, patient. A distant howl echoed through the stone corridor, a lonely, mournful sound. Wolves. Instinctively, Thomas's hand went to the pistol at his hip. His entire body tensed, a coiled spring of protective energy. He maneuvered Blaze so that his body was a shield between her and the direction of the sound. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears, but it wasn't just fear. It was awe. He didn't even think. He just acted. Protecting her was his immediate, unthinking response, but the howling wasn't aggressive. It was strange. It sounded less like a threat and more like a warning. Thomas seemed to think so too. He didn't draw his weapon. He just listened, his head cocked. "They're not hunting," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They're talking, telling us to turn back." The trail became too narrow and steep for the horses. They had to dismount and lead them. The ground was treacherous with loose gravel. Clara slipped, her ankle twisting. Before she could even cry out, his hand was on her arm, his grip like a vice, steadying her. "Easy now," he said, his touch lingering for a beat longer than necessary. The air between them crackled. By midday, the canyon opened into a small, hidden basin. At the far end was a cave, its mouth framed by strange, ancient-looking symbols carved into the rock. Spirals, arrows pointing in conflicting directions, and in the center, a heart. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the carvings to the map in her trembling hand. They matched. Her uncle's riddle spun in her head. Where shadows dance, the heart lies still. She looked up at Thomas. He stood at the entrance, his silhouette a massive black shape against the dim light within. He was watching the cliffs around them, his senses on high alert. He trusted her to handle the riddle, and he would handle the rest. She took a deep breath, the dust and the scent of damp stone filling her lungs. She whispered the words that had become their strange mantra. Too big for me, but I'll try. Clara squared her shoulders and stepped out of the blinding sun into the cool, silent dark of the cave. The darkness inside was absolute. For a moment, Clara was blind, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Then Thomas was beside her, striking a match. The tiny flame bloomed, pushing back the shadows, revealing walls covered in the same strange carvings they'd seen outside. The matchlight made the shadows on the walls twist and leap. They were dancing, where shadows dance. Her eyes scanned the carvings, looking for the next clue. Spirals, sunbursts, animal figures. And there, at eye level, etched deeper than the rest, was the heart. The heart lies still. It wasn't a picture. It was a button. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and pressed the stone heart. Nothing. Her hope sank. Was it all a lie? A wild goose chase? Thomas put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Wait," he rumbled, and then she heard it, a low, deep groan from within the rock itself. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The ground beneath their feet vibrated. With a deafening roar of stone grinding against stone, a huge section of the cave wall slid sideways, revealing a dark chamber beyond. A faint, golden light pulsed from within. Thomas let out a low whistle. "Smart city, gal," he said, a note of genuine awe in his voice. Clara felt a flush of pride, but it vanished in an instant. From the newly opened chamber, a sound rolled out that was far worse than the howl of any wolf. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very bones in her body. 2 points of amber light ignited in the darkness. Eyes, burning with cold, ancient intelligence. A creature stepped out of the shadows. It was built like a wolf, but it was far, far larger. Its fur was the color of midnight, and its teeth, bared in a silent snarl, were like yellowed daggers. This was no ordinary animal. This was the guardian Thomas had warned her about. Clara was frozen solid, the map clutched to her chest like a useless shield. "Thomas," she breathed, but he was already moving, stepping in front of her. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice as solid as the mountain around them. He didn't draw his gun. He drew a long, heavy-bladed knife from his belt. The beast lunged. The cave exploded into a whirlwind of violence. Snarls and the sickening thud of impact echoed off the walls. Thomas met the creature head-on, a clash of 2 primal forces. He wasn't just fighting it, he was wrestling it, his incredible strength pitted against its savage fury. Clara, snapping out of her terror, grabbed a heavy rock. But before she could move, Thomas's voice cut through the chaos, strained but clear. "Don't! I've got it!" With a final massive heave, he threw the beast to the ground, pinning it. For a terrifying second, they were locked in a stalemate, man and monster. Then the creature did something impossible. It stopped fighting. It let out a low whimper, a sound not of pain, but of submission. It looked past Thomas, its burning amber eyes fixing on something behind him. Panting, his shirt torn and blood trickling from a long scratch on his arm, Thomas followed its gaze. He was looking at Clara. But he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at a small silver locket she wore around her neck, a keepsake from her mother. The beast whimpered again, then slowly it backed away, melting back into the shadows of the deep chamber, and was gone. Thomas turned to her, his chest heaving. "You all right?" Clara could only nod, her mind reeling. The monster hadn't been defeated by his strength. It had been defeated by her locket. What in God's name was going on? The growls had faded, leaving a silence that was somehow more unnerving. Together they stepped into the chamber. The air was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. In the center of the room, on a flat stone pedestal, sat a weathered wooden chest bound in iron. It was real. Clara's hands shook as she approached it. She reached out and touched the latch. With a rusty groan, she lifted the lid. The firelight from Thomas's torch caught the contents, and the cave was filled with a dazzling, buttery glow. Gold coins, jewels, priceless artifacts, a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. But Clara barely saw it. Her gaze was fixed on something else, tucked amongst the glittering treasure. A leather-bound journal. Her uncle's journal. She lifted it out. The pages were filled with his familiar, spidery handwriting. But this was no travel log. It was a confession. Her uncle hadn't been a treasure hunter. He'd been an archaeologist, part of a secret society dedicated to protecting sacred Native American sites. This cave wasn't a treasure vault. It was a tomb. And the gold, it was a decoy, a lure for greedy men to distract them from the real significance of the place. The journal described a sacred artifact hidden even deeper in the cave system, something of immense spiritual power. And it described her uncle's partner, a ruthless man named Silas, who had betrayed the society. Silas didn't care about history or spirits. He wanted the artifact for his own dark purposes. Her uncle had created the riddle and the map not to lead his family to wealth, but to lead someone trustworthy here to protect the site from Silas. The locket Clara wore? It bore the crest of her family line, a line that had unknowingly been guardians for generations. The monster in the cave, the guardian, recognized the symbol. It wasn't attacking them. It was testing them. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling as she read the last entry. "He's coming. Silas. My uncle wrote that he's been hunting for this place for years." As the words left her mouth, a shadow fell across the entrance to the chamber. A man stood there, silhouetted against the light from the outer cave. He was tall and thin, with a cruel smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He held a pistol in his hand, aimed directly at them. Behind him stood a half-dozen rough-looking men, all armed. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice slick with venom. "It seems the niece has finished all the hard work for me." He took a step into the chamber, his eyes glinting as he saw the open chest. "Thank you, my dear. Your uncle was a sentimental fool. It was Silas. And he hadn't just been hunting for the cave. He had been following them the entire time. The air in the chamber went taut, stretched thin as a wire. Silas's cruel smile widened. "The journal," he said, gesturing with his pistol, "and the locket. Hand them over. The gold you can keep. A finder's fee." Clara clutched the journal to her chest. This was what her uncle had died to protect. She wouldn't just give it up. Thomas moved, a subtle shift of his weight, placing himself slightly in front of her. His hand hovered near the hilt of his big knife. "You'll have to go through me," he rumbled, his voice a low threat. Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, I don't think so, giant." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men dragged a third person into the cave entrance. It was the young stable boy from Dusty Gulch, the one who had helped Clara that first morning. He was gagged, his eyes wide with terror. "I believe you know this young man," Silas said smoothly. "It would be a shame if he had an accident. Now, the journal." Rage and helplessness warred inside Clara. They were trapped. Thomas was powerful, but he couldn't fight 7 armed men at once, not without getting the boy killed. Silas saw her hesitation and pressed his advantage. Your uncle was a fool, just like you. He babbled on about spirits and guardians. There's nothing here but rock and gold, and power. The artifact my dear uncle was so keen to hide. He knew. He knew everything. Thomas's eyes met Clara's. They were trapped, but there was no fear in his gaze, only a question. What now? Clara's mind raced, scrambling for a way out. The journal, the map. Her uncle had said the map was a key, not a path. The carvings on the wall. They weren't just decorations. They were instructions. Her eyes darted around the chamber, piecing it together. The spirals, the arrows. It was a schematic, a diagram of the cave's hidden mechanisms. Her uncle hadn't just built a puzzle box. He had built a trap. She took a shaky breath, her eyes locking with Thomas's again. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She had a plan. A crazy, desperate plan. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held out the journal. "You win." She started walking toward Silas, her boots scuffing on the stone floor. Thomas tensed, ready to spring. "No tricks, little girl," Silas warned, his pistol never wavering. "No tricks," she promised. She was halfway across the chamber when she stumbled, lurching sideways against the wall. Her hand shot out, not to steady herself, but to slam her palm against another one of those carved hearts, this one half hidden by a rock formation. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the whole world fell apart. With a deafening groan, a massive stone slab dropped from the ceiling, sealing the entrance to the chamber, plunging them into near total darkness. The only light was the single torch Thomas held. Silas's men shouted in panic. Silas himself let out a string of curses. "What did you do?" he shrieked, his voice losing its oily calm. But that was only the beginning. From deep within the cave system, a low growl echoed, multiplied by the stone walls, until it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. The Guardian was no longer submissive. It was hunting, and they had just locked themselves in its lair with it. Chaos erupted in the flickering torchlight. Silas's men were firing their guns blindly into the shadows, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. Ricochets whined off the stone walls. "Stop firing, you fools!" Silas screamed, but his men were in a full-blown panic. Through the mayhem, Clara saw Thomas moving. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature. He used the confusion and darkness to his advantage, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He disarmed one man with a single, brutal blow. He threw another into a wall with a sickening crunch. Clara scrambled back toward the treasure chest, her heart pounding. The journal, her uncle's last entry. There was a drawing, a detail she had overlooked. A second exit, a hidden passage behind the pedestal. A dark shape launched itself from the shadows. The Guardian. It wasn't attacking Thomas. It moved past him, a blur of black fur and teeth, and slammed into 2 of Silas's men, taking them down in a whirlwind of claws and snarls. The beast was fighting with them. Silas, seeing his men falling and his plan crumbling, finally lost his nerve. He turned his attention back to Clara. He lunged for her, grabbing her by the arm, his face a mask of insane fury. "You'll die for this," he snarled, shoving the barrel of his pistol under her chin. Thomas roared, a sound of pure rage, and started toward them. "Stay back," Silas screamed, dragging Clara with him, "or she gets it." They were at a standoff. Thomas, bloody but unbowed. Silas, desperate and cornered, and Clara with a cold steel barrel pressed against her throat. This was it, the final move. Clara locked eyes with Thomas over Silas's shoulder. She took a ragged breath and whispered the words. Their words. "Too big for me, but I'll try." It was the signal. Thomas didn't charge. He did the last thing Silas expected. He threw his torch to the ground. The chamber was plunged into absolute, total darkness. Silas grunted in surprise. For a split second, his grip on Clara loosened. It was all she needed. She stomped down, hard, on his instep with the heel of her boot. He howled in pain. At the same time, she brought her head back, smashing it into his nose with a sharp crack. He staggered back, releasing her, and in the pitch black she heard the one sound she'd been praying for, the sound of Thomas's massive fist connecting with Silas's jaw. It was a sickening thud, followed by the heavy fall of a body. Silence. Then a match scraped against stone. A tiny flame flickered to life, held in Thomas's steady hand. Silas was unconscious on the floor. His remaining men were either incapacitated or cowering in a corner, their bravado gone. The guardian beast sat silently near the back of the chamber, its amber eyes glowing in the low light, watching. Panting, bruised, but alive, Clara and Thomas looked at each other. It was over. But then a low rumble started, deeper than before. The entire cave began to shake violently. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. Clara's trap hadn't just sealed the entrance. It had destabilized the entire chamber. The whole place was coming down. The back passage, Clara yelled over the roar, pointing to the pedestal. Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the journal, shoved a few fistfuls of gold into a leather pouch, and then grabbed Silas, slinging the unconscious man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "No man left behind," he grunted. "He faces justice in Dusty Gulch." Together they heaved the stone pedestal aside, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The guardian beast gave a final, mournful howl and then disappeared into the shadows as they scrambled into the tunnel. Behind them, with a cataclysmic crash that shook the very foundations of the mountain, the treasure chamber collapsed, burying the cursed gold and its secrets forever. They stumbled out of the tunnel into the blinding afternoon sun, covered in dust and blood. The hidden exit had spit them out a half-mile down the canyon. They were alive. They were free. The journey back to Dusty Gulch was a blur. They had the journal, a small pouch of gold, and an unconscious villain. When they rode into town, leading a train of captured, bruised bandits, the townsfolk poured out of their homes and the saloon, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The stable boy, freed and unharmed, ran to them, babbling out the story of his capture. In the center of the dusty street, Thomas dumped Silas at the sheriff's feet. Clara held up the journal. "This man, Silas Croft," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, "murdered my uncle, Daniel Worthington. He came here to steal and desecrate a sacred place. This journal is my uncle's confession and the proof of his crimes." The town was silent, stunned. They looked from the defeated Silas to the towering cowboy and the city woman who stood beside him, no longer a porcelain doll, but a warrior forged in darkness and stone. They didn't just look at Thomas anymore. They saw him, the man who had faced down a gang of criminals, the man who had brought justice back to their town. The curse was broken, not by magic, but by courage. That night the saloon wasn't filled with suspicion. It was filled with celebration. Music played, and for the first time, the townsfolk weren't afraid of Thomas. They clapped him on the back, offered him drinks, and called him a hero. He was uncomfortable with the attention, but Clara stayed by his side, her hand resting on his arm. She found herself swept onto the makeshift dance floor, and Thomas, surprisingly, was not a clumsy dancer. He moved with a slow, steady grace, his huge hands gentle as he guided her. The whispers about the city gal and the giant were gone. In their place were stories of the canyon heroes. Days turned into weeks. The small pouch of gold was more than enough. Clara didn't buy a big ranch. She bought the old, dilapidated Worthington property on the edge of town, the one her uncle had left her. She used the rest of the gold to rebuild the town school and help fund a proper doctor's office. The silk dresses were packed away for good. She wore denim and leather now, her hands calloused from work, her face tanned by the sun. Thomas was always there, hammering fences, breaking wild horses, his quiet presence a constant, reassuring anchor. The ranch grew, not just from timber and sweat, but from shared laughter and silent understanding. Their first kiss wasn't dramatic or desperate. It happened one quiet evening on the porch, under a blanket of stars so thick it looked like spilled diamonds. "I thought I came here chasing a fortune," Clara murmured, her head resting against his shoulder. "But I found something better." He didn't say anything. He just bent his head and his lips met hers. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. They built a life, not on gold, but on something far more valuable: trust, courage, and a love that was as vast and wild as the land around them. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, they sat on that same porch, watching the cattle graze. Clara smiled, her voice soft and teasing. "You know," she said, poking him gently in his massive chest, "you're still too big for me." Thomas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. His deep laugh rolled across the quiet fields. "Maybe," he rumbled, his lips brushing against her hair, "but you'll always win." The wind carried their laughter into the night, a testament to the fact that the greatest treasures aren't buried under mountains. Sometimes they're standing right beside you, and all you have to do is be brave enough to try and find them. This story began with a hunt for gold, a city woman with a map, and a giant cowboy with a haunted past. But what they unearthed in that canyon went far beyond riches. They found the truth, they found justice, and they found each other. They proved that courage comes in all sizes, and that the strongest walls are the ones we build around our hearts. If tales of grit, hidden truths, and love, found in the wildest of places, are what you seek, then you found the right trail. Don't forget to subscribe and join our posse, because there are a whole lot more legends waiting to be told just around the bend.